When my billionaire daughter called to uninvite me from her wedding, I was mopping the floors of the very building where her company was headquartered. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally cleaning up after the empire I'd helped her build, 37 floors below the corner office where she now sat, deciding I wasn't good enough to witness her happiness. The phone buzzed against my hip at 11:47 p.m. Just as I was wringing out my mop for the last time, Lauren's name lit up the screen, and for a moment, my heart did that foolish dance it still did whenever my little girl called. Even at 62, even after everything, she could still make me feel like the most important man in the world, with just 3 letters, D-A-D. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, leaning the mop against the wall. Around me, the executive floor gleamed like a temple to success. Marble that cost more per square foot than most people made in a month. Windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a view of Seattle that made you feel like you owned the world. In a way, Lauren did own a piece of it. Her tech company, Morrison Analytics, had changed how the world thought about data. And at 32, she was worth more money than I could count in several lifetimes. "Dad." Her voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over the years. The one she used when she was about to ask for something difficult, or deliver news that would require me to be understanding. "We need to talk." I settled into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "What's on your mind, honey? Wedding jitters?" "That's normal, you know. When your mother and I—" "Dad, stop." The sharpness in her voice cut through the warm memory like a blade through silk. "This isn't about wedding jitters. This is about appearances." Something cold settled in my stomach. In the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see myself. A 62-year-old man in navy blue work coveralls, gray hair thinning at the crown, hands that bore the permanent stains of 30 years of honest labor. For the first time in decades, I felt ashamed of what I saw. "Appearances," I repeated. Lauren's sigh traveled through the phone like a winter wind. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This wedding, it's not just about Marcus and me. It's about our families, our reputations, the kind of statement we're making to the world. I thought the statement was that you loved each other. That's not what I mean, and you know it." Her voice took on the patient tone she used in board meetings, the one I'd overheard when she was explaining complex algorithms to investors who didn't understand technology. "Marcus's family, they're sophisticated people. His father built Chen Industries from the ground up. They summer in the Hamptons. They donate to the Met. They're featured in Fortune magazine. They expect a certain caliber of people at family events." Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that grew wider and wider until they touched every corner of my heart. "And I'm not that caliber? Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be." But I couldn't stop myself from asking the question that was clawing its way up my throat. "What did you tell them I do for a living?" The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I told them you work in building management." Building management. The euphemism sat between us like a polite lie at a dinner party, technically true, but designed to obscure rather than illuminate. I did work in buildings. I did manage to keep them clean. But we both knew that wasn't what she'd let them believe. "Lauren," I said, and I heard my own voice crack like ice under spring sun. "I raised you by myself after your mother died. I worked 3 jobs to pay for MIT. I took out a second mortgage so you could start your company. I... That was then, Dad. This is different. This is my wedding day. The most important day of my life. And I won't let anything compromise that. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. I looked around the gleaming office floor, at the awards on the walls, at the photographs of Lauren shaking hands with senators and CEOs and tech moguls. In every picture, she looked confident, powerful, unstoppable. In every picture, she was alone. So what are you saying, sweetheart? I'm saying that having you at the wedding wouldn't be appropriate for our image. Marcus's family has certain expectations, and frankly, Dad, you don't meet them. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the marble floor. The sound echoed through the empty office space like a gunshot, sharp and final. I stared at my reflection in the black window, seeing not just an old janitor in work clothes, but a man who had spent 30 years building something precious, only to discover it had been constructed on sand. I picked up the phone with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. Lauren was still talking, her voice distant and tinny through the speaker. Understand that this doesn't change how much I love you. You're still my father. But some things are more important than sentiment, and this wedding is one of them. I hope you can respect that. I see, I managed to say. I knew you'd understand. You've always been so reasonable about these things. I'll call you after the honeymoon, okay? We'll have dinner. Somewhere nice. My treat. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the echo of my own breathing and the hum of the building's ventilation system. I sat in that $1,000 chair for what felt like hours, watching the city sleep below me, thinking about the distance between the 37th floor and the ground. When I finally stood up, my knees protested with the familiar ache of too many years spent on my hands and knees, scrubbing floors and cleaning up other people's messes. I walked to Lauren's corner office, where the door bore her name in elegant gold lettering. Lauren Morrison, CEO. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, leaving a print that would need to be cleaned away before morning. That's when I saw it, lying crumpled in the wastebasket beside her assistant's desk. A wedding invitation. Thick, cream-colored paper with embossed gold lettering. I pulled it out and smoothed it against the desktop, reading my own name under Lauren's, followed by the phrase, "Cordially invites you to celebrate the union of Lauren Morrison and Marcus Chen." There was a sticky note attached in Lauren's handwriting. Image consultant says no blue-collar family visible. Handle delicately. I folded the invitation carefully and slipped it into my breast pocket next to my heart, where it felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried. Then I picked up my mop bucket, turned off the lights, and walked toward the elevator that would take me back down to earth. Back to the world where I belonged. But as the elevator descended, something else was rising inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous, understanding. For 30 years, I'd been cleaning up messes. Tomorrow I would start with the biggest one of all. The mess I'd made by raising a daughter who thought love could be measured in dollar signs and social status. The mess I'd made by teaching her that sacrifice was silent and gratitude was optional. The mess I'd made by believing that being a good father meant accepting whatever scraps of affection she chose to throw my way. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped out into the lobby, where the security guard nodded at me with the kind of respect one working man shows another. Outside, the Seattle dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of possibility, And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt like a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. I drove home through the empty Seattle streets with Lauren's crumpled wedding invitation burning like a coal in my breast pocket. The city looked different at dawn, softer somehow, as if the harsh edges of daylight hadn't yet carved their judgment into every surface. But I knew that gentleness was an illusion. By afternoon, the sun would be merciless, exposing every crack, every flaw, every place where the foundation had begun to crumble. Like the foundation I'd built for my daughter, one sacrifice at a time. The house on Maple Street had been our castle once. A modest 2-bedroom rambler with a postage stamp yard and a mortgage that stretched my paycheck thin even when Sarah was alive to help carry the load. Now it felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of better times and the echo of a little girl's laughter that had long since faded into memory. I sat in my truck in the driveway, unable to cross the threshold just yet. Through the living room window, I could see the corner where Sarah's piano had stood, where 8-year-old Lauren used to practice scales while I made dinner with one ear tuned to her progress and the other listening for the sound of my wife's cough from the bedroom upstairs. The cough that started as a whisper and ended as a roar that finally took her away from us when Lauren was barely old enough to understand what forever meant. That's when the real sacrifice began. I'd been 32 then, the same age Lauren was now. Young enough to start over, old enough to know that some chapters don't get rewrites. When the funeral expenses ate through our modest savings and Sarah's medical bills devoured the life insurance, I faced a choice that no parent should have to make. Put Lauren into the system where she might find a better life with a wealthier family, or keep her with me and pray that love could somehow compensate for everything I couldn't provide. I chose love. Some might say I chose selfishly. The memory pulled me back to that first Christmas without Sarah, when Lauren was 9 and still believed that asking Santa for her mother back might actually work. I'd been working double shifts at Morrison Industries, the same company Lauren now owned, doing night maintenance because it paid $1 more per hour and meant I could be home when she got off the school bus. "Daddy?" she'd said that Christmas morning, sitting cross-legged in front of our Charlie Brown tree with its handful of second-hand ornaments and dollar store lights. "I asked Santa for Mommy, but I got this instead." She held up a used laptop I'd bought from a pawn shop and spent 3 weeks learning how to refurbish. "I think Santa made a mistake." "No mistake, sweetheart," I'd said, kneeling down beside her in the wreckage of wrapping paper I'd saved from the year before. "That computer is magic. It can take you anywhere in the world, help you learn anything you want to know. Your mother and I, we always believed you were destined for something bigger than Maple Street." She'd looked at me with those serious eyes that made her seem older than her years. "But what if I don't want to go anywhere? What if I want to stay here with you?" If I'd known then what I know now, I might have said yes. I might have told her that staying was enough, that being together was the only destination that mattered. Instead, I said what I thought a good father should say. "Then you use that computer to build something so amazing that the whole world comes to you." That laptop became her first window into coding. I'd sit beside her for hours after my shifts, both of us squinting at tutorials on the small screen, me learning just enough to ask the right questions, her absorbing knowledge like a desert soaks up rain. When she needed books, I sold my father's watch. When she needed software, I took on weekend work cleaning offices. When she got accepted to MIT, I mortgaged the house. The house I was sitting in front of now, still paying for, still maintaining like a shrine to decisions. I wasn't sure I'd make the same way twice. I finally went inside and made coffee in the kitchen where Lauren had once stood on a step stool to help me make breakfast, chattering about algorithms and variables, while I tried to keep up with her brilliant mind. The refrigerator was covered with photographs spanning 24 years. Birthday parties, school plays, graduation ceremonies, each one marking another milestone in our journey together. But as I looked at them now, I began to notice something that chilled me more than the Seattle morning. In the early pictures, Lauren was always touching me, holding my hand, sitting on my lap, throwing her arms around my neck with the unself-conscious affection of a child who knew she was loved. But as the years progressed, the distance grew. By high school, we were standing side by side, but separate. By college, there was an actual space between us, as if an invisible wall had begun to build itself, brick by brick, between who she was becoming and where she came from. I pulled down one particular photo, Lauren's MIT graduation. She's wearing her cap and gown, holding her computer science degree, beaming at the camera. I'm standing beside her in the only suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to Sarah's funeral, my face shining with pride. At the bottom of the photo, Lauren had written in her careful script, "My dad sacrificed everything for my dreams. I love you, Daddy." That was 12 years ago. When had Daddy become Dad, and then become a problem to be managed? The answer came to me as I stared at the photo. It happened gradually, the way most heartbreaks do. Not with a single devastating blow, but with 1,000 small cuts, each one so minor you barely notice until you realize you're bleeding out. It started with her internships at tech companies, where everyone had MBAs and trust funds. "Dad, you don't understand how competitive this industry is," she'd say when I asked about her work. "Image matters. Perception is everything." It continued when she started her company and needed investors. "I'm not saying you can't come to the launch party, Dad. But maybe don't mention the janitor thing. Just say you work in facilities management." It accelerated when she made her first million. "Dad, I love you, but I can't have you cleaning the building where my company is headquartered. It's awkward. What if clients see? What if reporters ask questions?" And it crystallized last night, when she finally said out loud what had been growing in her heart for years. That love has limits. That sacrifice has an expiration date. That some bridges are meant to be burned in the name of progress. I walked to my bedroom and opened the shoe box where I kept our most important documents: birth certificates, insurance papers, the deed to the house. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was Sarah's engagement ring. A modest diamond that had cost me 3 months' salary when we were young and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer anything. I held it up to the window, watching the morning light fracture through the stone into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Sarah had wanted Lauren to have this ring when she got engaged. "Promise me," she'd whispered in the hospital, her voice already fading. "Promise me she'll know where she comes from." I'd promised, but promises, like diamonds, can be shattered under enough pressure. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. For a moment, my heart leaped with the foolish hope that it might be Lauren calling to apologize, to take back the words that had carved a canyon between us. Instead, it was Marcus. "Jim?" His voice was tight with something I couldn't identify. "Are you busy this morning? I'd like to come over and talk to you about something." Marcus Chen had always been polite to me, even kind, in the way that well-bred people are kind to their future in-laws' help. He called me sir and asked about my work with genuine interest. or at least a good imitation of it. But there was something different in his voice now, something that made my pulse quicken. "Of course," I said. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," he said. "My father wants to meet you. He's in town for the wedding, and he has some questions about Lauren's family." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't yet see, but could definitely smell. "Questions?" "Jim, what exactly did Lauren tell my family about your background?" I closed my eyes and felt the weight of 30 years of sacrifice pressing down on my shoulders like stones. "What did she tell you she told them?" "She said you work in building management." His voice was careful, diplomatic. "My father is curious about the specifics." Building management. The lie that had seemed like such a small kindness when Lauren first suggested it now felt like a noose around my neck. "Marcus," I said, "your father wouldn't happen to be the kind of man who values honesty, would he?" There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried the weight of understanding. "Jim, I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation. And I think my father needs to meet the man who raised the woman I'm supposed to marry." After I hung up, I sat in my living room surrounded by photographs of a relationship I'd thought was built on love, but now realized had been constructed from something far more fragile. The need to belong to something bigger than ourselves, even if it meant leaving ourselves behind. In 3 hours, Marcus would arrive with his father, and I would have to decide, do I continue the lie that makes Lauren's life easier, or do I tell the truth that might set us both free? I looked at Sarah's ring one more time, then slipped it into my pocket next to the crumpled wedding invitation. Some promises, I realized, are kept not by doing what the dead asked, but by remembering what they believed in. Sarah had believed in truth. She had believed that love without honesty was just another word for fear. It was time to stop being afraid. Marcus arrived at noon with his father in tow, and I knew immediately that my carefully constructed world was about to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. David Chen stepped out of the black sedan with the quiet confidence of a man who had built empires from nothing and wasn't impressed by much. He was shorter than I'd expected, maybe 5'7", with silver hair and hands that looked like they remembered honest work. But it was his eyes that caught me. Dark, intelligent, and carrying the kind of depth that comes from understanding both sides of struggle. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice." His handshake was firm, calloused. This was not a man who had been born into wealth, and something in his manner told me he hadn't forgotten where he came from. I led them into my modest living room, acutely aware of how different it must look to men who probably lived in houses that could fit mine in their garages. "Can I get you coffee?" I asked, falling back on the hospitality my mother had taught me when I was too young to understand that sometimes politeness is just fear wearing a Sunday suit. "That would be nice," David said, settling into my worn recliner like he belonged there. Marcus perched on the edge of the couch, tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. As I prepared coffee in the kitchen, I could hear them speaking in low voices. Not the words, but the tone. Serious, concerned. The way people talk when they're trying to solve a problem that has no good solutions. When I returned with 3 mugs of coffee that had cost less than what they probably spent on lunch, David looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "Jim, may I call you Jim? I understand you work in building management." The lie sat between us like a landmine, waiting for someone to step wrong. I glanced at Marcus, whose face had gone pale, then back at David. "That's what Lauren told you?" "Among other things." David's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to gather information before making judgments. "She's told us quite a bit about her family, actually. How her parents were both in business, how she inherited her entrepreneurial spirit, how she's essentially self-made." Each word felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of the relationship I'd spent 30 years building with my daughter. I set down my coffee cup with hands that trembled like autumn leaves in wind. "Mr. Chen," I said, "what exactly would you like to know?" Before he could answer, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted from nervous to something approaching horror. "It's Lauren," he said. "She's at the hotel with the wedding planner. She wants us to come over. Something about finalizing details." David raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps we should go. Jim, would you mind joining us? I find that wedding planning often reveals a great deal about a person's character." The drive to the Four Seasons took 20 minutes through Seattle traffic. 20 minutes of small talk that felt like walking through a minefield. David asked about my work, my neighborhood, my thoughts on the weather, all with the casual precision of a man conducting an interview disguised as conversation. I answered honestly, because at my age, lies require more energy than I had to spare. When we arrived at Lauren's penthouse suite, I could hear voices before we even knocked. Lauren's voice, sharp with the kind of anxiety that comes from trying to control too many variables at once. And another voice, professionally cheerful in the way that people are when they're being paid to make problems disappear. Marcus used his key, and we walked into a scene that looked like a magazine spread about how the other half plans their weddings. Flowers everywhere, fabric samples draped over every surface. A woman in an expensive suit standing over a tablet, stylus in hand like a conductor's baton. "Marcus, finally," Lauren said, rushing over to kiss his cheek. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. Her hair pulled back in the kind of casual elegance that takes an hour and a professional to achieve. She looked beautiful, successful, and utterly foreign to me, like someone I might have known once, in another life. Then she saw me. "Dad," she said, and for just a moment, her carefully composed mask slipped. "What are you doing here?" "I invited him," David said quietly. "I wanted to meet the man who raised such an accomplished daughter." Lauren's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Dad, I'd like you to meet Vivian Carstairs, our wedding planner." "Vivian, this is my father." Vivian extended a manicured hand. "So lovely to meet you, Mr. "Morrison," I said. "Jim Morrison." "Oh, how wonderful." "And what do you do, Mr. Morrison?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I felt Lauren's eyes on me, willing me to play along, to be the version of myself that fit into her carefully constructed narrative. I thought about 30 years of sacrifice, about the crumpled wedding invitation in my pocket, about Sarah's ring and the promises we make to the dead. "I'm a janitor," I said. The silence that followed was profound. The kind of quiet that comes after explosions when the dust is still settling, and no one knows yet what's been destroyed. "I'm sorry," Vivian said, her professional smile wavering like a candle in wind. "I clean buildings for a living, have for 30 years. I worked nights at Morrison Industries, among other places." Lauren's face went through a series of expressions, shock, embarrassment, anger, before settling on something that looked like panic. "Dad, you're being modest. You work in facilities management." "No, sweetheart," I said, and the endearment tasted bitter on my tongue. "I mop floors, I empty trash cans, I clean toilets. I'm a janitor." Marcus was staring at Lauren with something approaching horror. David Chen was studying me with the intensity of a man trying to solve a complex equation. "But Lauren said," Vivian began, then stopped, her trained diplomacy kicking in. "What exactly did Lauren say?" David asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers. Vivian glanced nervously between Lauren and the rest of us. "Well, she mentioned that her father worked in building management, that her family were successful business people. She said she came from entrepreneurial stock." "I see," David said. "And what about her mother?" "A businesswoman as well, I believe. Lauren said her parents taught her everything about running a company." I felt something break inside my chest, not with the sharp crack of a bone snapping, but with the slow, inexorable grinding of a foundation giving way under too much weight. Sarah had been a music teacher before she got sick. She'd never run anything more complex than our household budget, and had done that with the careful precision of someone who knew that every dollar mattered. "Mr. Chen," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "my wife Sarah was a music teacher. She died of cancer when Lauren was 9. I raised Lauren by myself, working whatever jobs I could find that would let me be home when she got off the school bus. I mortgaged this house to pay for MIT. I took out loans against my life insurance to help her start her company. But I never ran a business in my life. I just tried to be a good father." The room felt like the aftermath of an earthquake. Everything shifted, and nothing quite where it belonged anymore. Lauren was staring at me with a mixture of fury and terror. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped, and David Chen was nodding slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "Lauren," Marcus said, his voice careful and controlled. "Is this true?" "It's more complicated than that," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dad's being overly dramatic. Answer the question," David said, and there was steel in his voice now, the kind of authority that had built Chen Industries from a single restaurant into a global empire. "Did you lie about your family background?" Lauren's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. In this industry, image is everything. Background matters. I couldn't have potential investors thinking I came from what?" I asked quietly. She looked at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been hatred. "From nothing, Dad. From absolutely nothing. From a janitor and a dead music teacher and a house on Maple Street that smells like pine sol and broken dreams." The words hit me like physical blows, each one finding its mark with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to aim to cause maximum damage. But it was the last part that nearly brought me to my knees. Not the insults to me, but the casual dismissal of Sarah's memory. As if the woman who had loved us both, who had filled our small house with music and laughter and hope, was just another inconvenience to be erased in the name of progress. David Chen stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room like thunder. "Young lady," he said, "I started with nothing. I washed dishes in restaurant kitchens for 12 years before I saved enough money to buy my first food truck. I lived in a one-room apartment above a laundromat and ate rice and vegetables for dinner every night for a decade. And I'm proud of every single day of that struggle. because it taught me something that all your MIAs and profit reports never will. He turned to Marcus. Son, I think we need to discuss whether this is the kind of woman you want to build a family with. Mr. Chen, please, Lauren said, desperation creeping into her voice. You don't understand the pressures of this industry. The expectations. I understand, David said. That character isn't something you can buy or fake or manage like a brand. I understand that a woman who would be ashamed of the man who sacrificed everything for her success is not someone I want in my family. He walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. Jim, I want you to know that what you did, raising a daughter alone, working multiple jobs to pay for her education, sacrificing your own comfort for her dreams, that's not nothing. That's everything. That's exactly the kind of man I'd be honored to call family. Then he turned to Lauren one last time. The wedding is off. Marcus, we're leaving. As they walked toward the door, David paused. Oh, and Lauren? The $500,000 we were contributing to the wedding expenses? Consider it a lesson in why character matters more than image. Some things can't be bought, and respect is at the top of that list. The door closed behind them with a finality that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Lauren stood frozen in the center of her perfect wedding planning suite, surrounded by flowers and fabric samples and dreams that had just crumbled into dust. Dad, she whispered. And for a moment she sounded 9 years old again, lost and scared, and needing her father to make everything better. But I was tired of making things better at the cost of making myself smaller. Goodbye, Lauren, I said, and walked out into the Seattle afternoon, where the sun was shining and the air smelled like possibility instead of pine sol and broken dreams. I drove home in a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The Seattle streets seemed different now, painted with the strange light that comes after storms, when everything looks both exactly the same and completely transformed. I kept expecting to feel something, triumph, vindication, the sweet satisfaction of justice served. But instead, I felt hollow, like a house after the furniture has been moved out, but before the new owners arrive. The weight of what had just happened settled over me like silt in still water. I had told the truth, finally, completely, without softening the edges or painting it in prettier colors. And in doing so, I had lost my daughter as surely as if she had died. When I pulled into my driveway, the house on Maple Street looked smaller somehow, as if witnessing my moment of truth had shrunk it down to its proper size. No longer the castle where I had raised a princess, just a modest rambler where a man had done his best with what he had. I sat in my truck for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled. Sarah's engagement ring heavy in my pocket next to the crumpled wedding invitation that would never be used. Through the living room window, I could see the photographs on the refrigerator, the shrine to a relationship that had been built on shifting sand and held together by love on one side and obligation on the other. My phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Mr. Morrison, this is Marcus. Would it be possible to speak with you? There are things I need to understand. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Of course, I'm at home. He arrived 20 minutes later, alone this time, driving a modest Honda instead of the black sedan he'd shared with his father. When he knocked on my door, I could see through the glass that his usual composure had been replaced by something rawer. The look of a man who had just watched his future collapse and was trying to figure out where to place the blame. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let him pass. He walked into my living room, like a man entering a crime scene, looking around with new eyes at the photographs, the worn furniture, the careful maintenance that comes from loving something you can't afford to replace. When his gaze landed on the wall of pictures chronicling Lauren's journey from little girl to billionaire, he stopped and studied them with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ruins. "She was beautiful," he said quietly, pointing to a picture of 8-year-old Lauren missing her 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera while holding up a trophy from her school's science fair. "She still is," I said, settling into my recliner. "Beauty isn't something that disappears when someone disappoints you." Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, forearms on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I think I've proven I'm willing to do that. Did you know about the lies she told my family?" The question hung between us like smoke from a fire I couldn't see, but could definitely smell. I thought about the gradual evolution of janitor to facilities management to building management, each step a small compromise that had seemed harmless at the time. "I knew she was editing the truth," I said finally. "But I didn't know how extensively until today. I thought it was just a small kindness, a way to make things easier for everyone." "Easier for who?" "For her. For you. For your family. I thought..." I paused, searching for the right words. "I thought that love meant making yourself smaller, so the people you care about could be bigger." Marcus looked up at me with something that might have been pity. "How long have you been making yourself smaller, Jim?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was kind. Because it suggested that someone had finally noticed the slow erosion of self that comes from loving someone more than they love you back. "Since Sarah died," I said. "Maybe before that. It's hard to say when sacrifice becomes self-destruction. The line moves so gradually you don't notice until you've crossed it completely." We sat in silence for a moment. 2 men contemplating the wreckage of relationships we had thought were built to last. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn. The sound of suburban normalcy, a strange counterpoint to the earthquake that had just reshuffled the landscape of our lives. "My father wants to offer you a job," Marcus said suddenly. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry?" "Executive custodial services for Chen Industries. It's a real position. Overseeing cleaning operations for all our facilities, training programs, quality control. The salary would be significant. More than you've probably ever made." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. And for a moment, I felt a surge of something that might have been hope. Then reality settled back over me like a familiar blanket. "That's very generous of your father," I said. "But I can't accept it." "Why not?" "Because it would still be charity. Kinder charity, more dignified charity, but charity nonetheless. And I've spent too many years accepting scraps of affection disguised as generosity. I think it's time I started expecting what I deserve, instead of being grateful for what I'm given." Marcus nodded slowly, and I could see something like respect flicker across his face. "What do you deserve, Jim?" "I deserve a daughter who's proud of me. I deserve relationships built on truth instead of convenience. I deserve to stop apologizing for being exactly who I am." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "What about you, Marcus? What do you deserve?" He was quiet for so long I wondered if he had forgotten the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I deserve a partner who wouldn't be ashamed to introduce me to her father. I deserve someone who understands that love isn't a public relations campaign. He looked around my living room one more time, taking in the careful preservation of memories, the obvious signs of a man who had built something meaningful with his own hands. I deserve someone who would be proud to come from a place like this. My phone rang, cutting through the moment like a blade through silk. Lauren's name appeared on the screen, and both Marcus and I stared at it as if it were a snake that might strike. "Answer it," Marcus said quietly. I picked up on the fourth ring. "Hello, Lauren." "Dad?" Her voice was thick with tears, stripped of the professional composure that had become her armor. "Dad, please, we need to talk. I can fix this. I can make it right." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. I always do. You know that about me, Dad. I'm a problem solver. That's what you taught me." "I taught you a lot of things, sweetheart. Problem solving was just one of them. Please don't do this. Please don't give up on me. Not now. Not after everything we've been through together." I closed my eyes and saw her at 9 years old, standing in our kitchen after Sarah's funeral, asking me if I was going to leave her too. I had promised her then that I would never leave, that we would face whatever came together, that love was stronger than any problem we might encounter. But some promises, I realized, become prisons when they're built on the expectation that only one person will do the sacrificing. "Lauren," I said, my voice gentler than it had been in years, "I'm not giving up on you. I'm giving up on the version of me that you needed in order to love me. And maybe that will give you room to figure out if you can love the real me instead." "I don't understand." "I know you don't. But maybe someday you will." I hung up and set the phone aside, aware that Marcus was watching me with something approaching awe. "That must have been the hardest thing you've ever done," he said. "No," I replied, thinking of 30 years of small compromises, of making myself smaller and smaller until I almost disappeared completely. "The hardest thing I ever did was forgetting who I was in the first place." Marcus stood up, extending his hand. When I shook it, his grip was firm, respectful, the handshake of one man acknowledging another as an equal. "Jim, for whatever it's worth, meeting you has been one of the most important experiences of my life. You've shown me what integrity looks like, even when it costs everything." After he left, I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in years. The worn carpet that I had been embarrassed about, the outdated kitchen that had fed my family for decades, the photographs that chronicled not failure, but the slow, steady building of something precious. I pulled Sarah's engagement ring from my pocket and held it up to the evening light streaming through the living room window. The diamond wasn't large, but it caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny rainbows, each one a reminder that beauty doesn't depend on size or cost, but on the love that gives it meaning. Tomorrow, I would return to work. I would mop floors and empty trash cans and clean up other people's messes, just as I had for 30 years. But I would do it as a man who had remembered his own worth, who had chosen truth over comfort, who had finally learned the difference between love and enabling. And perhaps, if Lauren was as smart as I had always believed her to be, she would eventually understand that the greatest gift a parent can give a child is not protection from consequences, but the courage to face them with dignity. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of home. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the mantel clock, the whisper of wind through the trees I had planted when Lauren was small. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Crisp white paper that felt substantial in my hands, embossed with gold lettering that caught the early spring light streaming through my kitchen window. For a moment, my heart did that old familiar dance it used to do whenever anything came from Lauren, until I read the names at the top. Marcus Chen and Elizabeth Warren request the honor of your presence. I set the invitation down carefully on my kitchen table, next to the coffee that had grown cold while I stared at evidence that the world had continued turning long after mine had stopped. Marcus was getting married to someone else. Someone whose father, I presumed, she wasn't ashamed to introduce to her future in-laws. There was a handwritten note tucked inside the formal invitation. Marcus's careful script on personal stationery. Jim, I know this might be strange to receive, but Elizabeth and I would be honored if you would attend our wedding. You taught me something about character that changed the course of my life. I'd like you to meet the woman who understands why that matters. If you're willing, I'd be proud to have you walk Elizabeth down the aisle. Her father passed away last year, and she could use someone who knows what real sacrifice looks like. Marcus, I read the note 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, like peeling back the pages of a book I thought I'd finished. Marcus hadn't just moved on from Lauren. He'd found someone who apparently valued the same things David Chen had recognized in me that day at the Four Seasons: authenticity, sacrifice. The quiet dignity of work, honestly done. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David Chen's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with the kind of curiosity that comes from knowing that some conversations change everything. Jim. His voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship, something that had grown between us over the months since that confrontational afternoon. Did you get Marcus's invitation? Just arrived, I said. I'm honored he thought of me, but walking someone down the aisle, that seems like something for family. You are family, David said simply. Maybe not by blood, but by something more important. By choice. By respect. By the understanding that character isn't inherited. It's built, day by day, sacrifice by sacrifice. I looked around my kitchen, at the photographs still covering the refrigerator, though I'd added new ones now, pictures from dinners with David and his wife, from barbecues in their backyard, where I'd been welcomed not as charity, but as an equal, as a man whose company was genuinely enjoyed. What about Lauren? I asked. The silence stretched for a moment before David answered. What about her? Have you heard anything? I've heard that Morrison Analytics is struggling. Turns out that when your success is built on lies, the foundation tends to be unstable. Several investors pulled out after word got around about her character issues. But that's not your concern anymore, Jim. You can't save people who won't save themselves. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen holding the wedding invitation, thinking about the strange arithmetic of relationships. How some people spend years trying to add up to something they think others want them to be, while others discover that subtraction might be the answer. That removing the false parts of yourself can make room for something real to grow. Over the past 6 months, I had learned to live without the constant weight of Lauren's disapproval, without the exhausting effort of making myself small enough to fit into her vision of respectability. I'd kept my job at Morrison Industries, though I'd been offered positions elsewhere. There was something satisfying about continuing to clean the building that housed the company my sacrifice had helped create. knowing now that I was there by choice rather than desperation. The building felt different now. The marble floors reflected my image back with a clarity that had nothing to do with how well I'd polished them. I was the same man doing the same work, but I carried myself differently, shoulders back, head up, like someone who had remembered that honest work was nothing to apologize for. 3 weeks before Marcus's wedding, Lauren called. I almost didn't answer. Her name on my phone screen had lost its power to make my heart race. But it could still make it pause, like hearing a song from a time in your life you weren't sure you wanted to remember. "Dad," she said, and her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Not the confident CEO, not the ashamed daughter, but someone who sounded genuinely lost. "Hello, Lauren. I know I don't have the right to ask, but can we talk in person? There are things I need to say, and I need to say them to your face." She suggested meeting at the Four Seasons, which would have been fitting in a way that bordered on the poetic, returning to the scene of our mutual destruction. Instead, I suggested she come to the house on Maple Street. If we were going to have this conversation, it would be on my terms, in the place where I had learned to remember who I was. She arrived the next evening, driving a modest sedan instead of her usual luxury car, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the designer armor she'd once used to signal her distance from our shared past. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, like a house after a storm when you can finally see how much damage the wind has done. "The place looks good," she said, settling into the same chair David Chen had occupied months earlier. "Did you repaint the kitchen?" "Last month," I said. "Yellow. Your mother always said yellow was the color of hope." She nodded, and I could see her looking around with different eyes, seeing not the limitations she'd once been embarrassed by, but the care that had gone into maintaining something precious on a budget that required choosing between wants and needs. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it all before you respond, okay?" I nodded and waited. "I lost everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The company, most of my money, my reputation. Turns out that when you build your success on lies, people notice eventually. Marcus was right to leave. David Chen was right to cut me off. You were right to stop enabling me." She took a shaky breath. "But the worst part isn't the money, or the company, or even Marcus. The worst part is that I became someone I don't recognize. Someone who could look at a man who sacrificed everything for her and see only an embarrassment. Someone who could hear the story of my father working 3 jobs to put me through school and think it made me look weak instead of loved." Tears were running down her face now, and I felt the old urge to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to resume the familiar pattern of my pain being less important than her distress. But I stayed in my chair and let her finish. "I don't know if you can forgive me," she continued. "I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I threw away. I finally understand that having a father who would sacrifice everything for his daughter's dreams isn't something to be ashamed of. It's the most precious gift in the world." The room fell silent, except for the sound of her crying and the ticking of the mantel clock that had marked time through all the years of our shared history. The good ones and the bad ones, and the ones we were still learning how to categorize. "Lauren," I said finally, "I forgive you." She looked up at me with surprise, as if she'd expected a longer negotiation. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And it's not the same as going back to the way things were. I won't make myself small again, not for you, not for anyone. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with the real me. A janitor who's proud of his work. A man who raised a brilliant daughter and doesn't apologize for doing it on a budget. Someone who values character over image and truth over convenience. I want that, she said quickly. I want to know that person. I want to learn how to be proud of where I came from instead of ashamed. That's going to take time and work, and probably more uncomfortable conversations than either of us wants to have. She nodded. I have time now. The company's gone, the fancy life is over. All I have left is the question of whether I can learn to be someone worth knowing. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Stripped of her armor, her pretensions, her desperate need to be someone other than who she was, she looked more like the little girl I remembered than she had in decades. Not perfect, not successful by the world's standards, but real. Would you like to stay for dinner? I asked. I was going to make spaghetti. Nothing fancy, just the way your mother used to make it. She smiled through her tears, and for the first time in years, it looked genuine. I'd like that very much. As I cooked dinner, she told me about the collapse of her company, about the friends who disappeared when her net worth evaporated, about the slow, painful process of discovering who she was when she wasn't defined by her success. And I told her about Marcus's wedding, about David Chen's friendship, about the peace I'd found in remembering that I was enough exactly as I was. Are you going to walk her down the aisle? She asked. I think I am. Good, she said. Someone should have a father who's proud to be seen with them on the most important day of their life. 2 weeks later, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to her MIT graduation, and walked Elizabeth Warren down the aisle toward Marcus, who was waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes and joy written across his face. David Chen was his best man, and when Elizabeth placed her hand on my arm and whispered, "Thank you for showing Marcus what real love looks like," I understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the example of choosing dignity over convenience, truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance. Lauren wasn't at the wedding, but she sent a card, simple, heartfelt, congratulating Marcus on finding someone who appreciated the man he was rather than the image he projected. It was signed simply, "Learning to be better. Lauren." After the reception, David and I stood on the hotel balcony overlooking Elliott Bay, watching the ferries carry people home to places they belonged. "Do you think she'll figure it out?" he asked. "Your daughter?" "I don't know," I said. "But I've learned that you can't save people by making yourself smaller. You can only show them what's possible and hope they choose to reach for it. And if they don't, then you love them from a distance and trust that the lessons you taught by living them will eventually take root." The Seattle skyline glittered before us, full of lights and possibilities, and I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. From a man desperate for scraps of his daughter's affection to someone who had learned that love without respect was just another word for enabling, that sacrifice without boundaries was just another form of self-destruction. Sarah's engagement ring was still in my jewelry box at home, waiting for the day when Lauren might be ready to inherit not just the diamond, but the understanding of what it represented. Love that builds rather than diminishes. Commitment that strengthens rather than controls. The courage to choose truth even when lies would be easier. That day might come, or it might not. But I had finally learned that my worth wasn't contingent on her choices, that my love didn't require her approval, that a parent's greatest gift might sometimes be the space to fail, and the faith that failure isn't the end of the story. The ferry horns echoed across the water, calling people home, and I realized that after 30 years of trying to be enough for someone else, I had finally learned to be enough for myself. It was, I thought, a good place to start. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more tales of family, sacrifice, and the courage to choose truth over comfort. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we carry within ourselves.